So let's bring in legal and political analyst Terry Canfield. Terry, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So first, let's set the backstory here. Is this committee just kind of fact-finding, or are they supposed to find and announce things that could lead to criminal charges?
Well, Congress can and probably will make criminal referrals to the Department of Justice, but that is in no way the point. And I think if we start thinking that it is, we may miss the goal. So investigating what happened and putting the truth in front of the American people and getting Americans to engage in a dialogue about the dangerous elements that led to the insurrection is the goal. And that's not the goal of a criminal proceeding. As an aside, I'll mention that the task of the DOJ is considerably harder. It's easier to show that behavior is reprehensible and morally wrong than it is to collect evidence to prove each element of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So I think it's important that we separate these functions.
I think that's an important distinction, but you mentioned getting the American people to engage, and so much of that engagement, at least from one side, is directed at Merrick Garland. He's catching a lot of heat, especially on social media, for seemingly not doing enough. Is that a fair assessment, or is there a bigger process happening behind the scenes, behind the headlines?
Well, I don't even think it's behind the scenes or behind the headlines. I think it's right out there in front if people know how to read it and understand it. So, for example, the Department of Justice has repeatedly said what it's doing. It said that it's starting with the obvious crimes right in front of it: assaulting a police officer, destroying property at the Capitol, starting basically at the bottom and working its way up. And this is different from what a congressional investigative body will do. But this is what the DOJ has said it's doing. And it works its way up. One facts lead to other facts. Now, what we have had so far is we started with the foot of the foot soldiers, the bottom rung. And then those have led to, the DOJ, in connection with the insurrection, has indicted and gotten guilty pleas from leaders of these white supremacy militias. Now, that should be a big deal. And they're, again, working their way up. So we have evidence in the public reporting that they've issued subpoenas that have named Donald Trump in these subpoenas. A subpoena that was issued to Peter Navarro specifically wanted communications with Trump. And they're looking at they've issued subpoenas for fundraising, all kinds of things, but they're working their way up. And a congressional committee starts at the top. They go right for the top, and the DOJ is working its way up. And when all you're concerned about is the top, you miss some very important things that are happening, and seeing that they are climbing the ladder. Like I said, it's a big deal to be taking down the leaders of these white supremacy militias. Yeah, this is who carried out the. Go ahead.
So you mentioned the DOJ starting at the bottom and congressional leaders starting at the top. It's got to meet at some point somewhere. A lot of people out there are wondering, how far up this is going to go. Do you think there's a world in which Donald Trump or the inner circle there could actually be charged with a crime?
I do, and I think that what people need to understand is that the criminal investigation and any criminal proceedings are going to be very complicated. They're not as simple as they look, because what Trump is very good at doing is shielding himself. So everything he said on the eclipse that day when he was riling up the crowd, he points to everything and says, "Well, people say fight all the time." He's hiding behind these words. It's always easier to get the person who committed the crime on camera in front of witnesses than it is to get the planners. So it's easier to get the murderer than it is to get the person who hired the murderer. It's to take an example. So it's so much harder than it looks to penetrate this sort of barrier in the layers of insulation. Now, we know this actually from, I'm trained in criminal law, but I also read The Godfather. And the mob teaches us how this works, that the top people in a mob, they give their orders in private. They don't give orders in front of witnesses. They don't put things in writing. They're very careful. And so it's a lot harder to get to these people than it looks like. And there's every indication that the DOJ is working its way up carefully. Now, just one example. It's hard to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal proceeding. So what the DOJ is managing to do right now is get guilty pleas from people who are not the bottom rung, but up from the bottom. So they're pleading guilty and offering to cooperate. So this is huge. It's a lot easier to get the people at the top if the people in the middle decide to cooperate and start turning over evidence.
Now, I think
so if you start from the top, it's a lot harder to get the evidence you need.
I think that that's something most people can understand, but as you were going through your answer there, we were showing these images from January 6th, and can you really blame people who saw what happened on that day? And here we are a year and a half later, and we have midterm elections right around the corner. Can you really blame people for being upset when they see individuals going on probation, getting a slap on the wrist, and getting back out there? Some of them are even running for office right now. So what do you say to the American people who are seeing this and becoming impatient?
Well, the first thing I say is that the criminal justice system is not designed or set up to solve a political problem. And so we don't put people in jail. As it is, the American people, we have a very large criminal prison system. But people who are getting probation, if it's your first time and you damage property, then you don't have huge sentences. And as far as yes, there's no doubt in my mind that Donald Trump stirred up that crowd and got them to attack the Capitol. There's really no doubt in my mind, and I think anybody who's paying attention. It's a different issue to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. And as far as sort of this impatience, I think if you start comparing this investigation with similar investigations and how long they take, this is going quite quickly, quite fast. Things just take a while, and this is the Department of Justice has said that this is one of the most labor-intensive, resource-intensive, complex investigations in our history. And so they're working their way up, trying to be careful, getting all the evidence they need so that they're not in a situation where a person gets acquitted at a trial. We saw what happened with, who was that, Kyle Rittenhouse, right? He got acquitted. O.J. Simpson got acquitted. And so you don't want to get to that point. You don't want to hurry it. So if you start from the top and say, well, we all know he's guilty, the problem is that the rules of evidence don't work like that. Evidence to come in at a criminal trial, evidence has to meet certain standards. And we all know he did it isn't enough to get a criminal conviction. And so as far as impatience, I think that some of it comes from believing that the criminal justice system can solve a political problem. Yeah. And we have a political problem. You can't put them all in jail. You could put everybody who committed a crime in jail, but what are you going to do? Put everybody who was rooting for them in jail? They're always going to be, with fascist movements or extremist movements, there's always going to be more people coming up. So just to take an example, at the end of World War II, the fascist leaders came to horrible ends, but fascism came back. So I think the idea that somehow an indictment is going to sway an election strikes me as a little bit maybe naive or hopeful that some magic bullet will do our work for us.
Yeah, Terry, I think what's on the minds of a lot of people is if the DOJ is only going to take cases that they're sure they can win, then that's possibly an indication that they're not going to take a case all the way up to the top, as you were referring to. So there's a lot to consider.
No, that's not, actually, they have standards they follow, and that's not the standard. When they bring an indictment, the standard is whether they believe they have evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to prove. And so when they believe they have the evidence to prove it, they bring the indictment. So I don't think it's true that they only bring things they know they can win. They bring things that meet a certain standard of evidence. And I think that's what they're looking for right now, is the evidence that meets that standard.
I guess you could say, though, evidence that proves beyond the reasonable doubt would be an indication that they believe they can win the case. So, listen, Terry, I could talk to you about this all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I thank you so much for drawing that distinction between the legalities and the politics. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.